Hello, folks. My name is Kelly Lendsay, and my pleasure to be joining the Canadian Institute of Actuaries to do this presentation on the Indigenous advantage, growing Indigenous engagements and workplace inclusion strategies. As I said, my name is Kelly Lendsay, President and CEO of Indigenous Works. I went to your website and I was looking at this phrase that I quite like, seeing beyond risk. And the other side of risk, of course, is opportunity. That's what boards of directors do in Canada every day. And I think that after this session, I hope that you will see opportunities to better look at the risk opportunity ratio with Indigenous people in Canada today. The other thing I found quite interesting was the work that you've done on policy, insight, and advice statements. And I'm hoping that this is the beginning of a relationship to see what kind of statements we could make together about Indigenous engagement in Canada. So let me tell you what we're going to address today. I'm going to take you through Indigenous 101, the 4 pillars of exclusion and inclusion. And look at it this way. None of us learned our Indigenous history or knowledge in our school systems. So this will be the compressed version of Indigenous 101. We'll talk about growing the path of inclusion, how to drive change through employer leadership. Going to share some things about new innovations in Indigenous inclusion, what's happening in corporate Canada and in the Indigenous domain. Look at truth and reconciliation, and specifically the corporate calls to action. I'm going to introduce you to the workplace inclusion continuum, which is a systems-based approach to workplace change. And finally, Luminary, which is about advancing Indigenous innovation. So lots of material to cover, but the goal is to really, I think, provide you with and improve the knowledge capital of your people throughout the organization. So a bit about us. We were formed in 1998, and our organization used to be called the Aboriginal Human Resource Development Council of Canada. We came out of the 1996 report on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. We've been doing work in Indigenous engagement, more on corporate Indigenous engagement, workplace inclusion systems, and corporate Indigenous partnership systems. And we've got this expanding research agenda, a new initiative called Luminary that I want to share with you. I want to ask you this question. We'll come back to it a bit later, but if you were to rank your current level of knowledge, what would you say it is? Is it 1, little to none? Or is it 3, fair? Or is it excellent? Just make a little note on your notepad, and we'll come back to this question at the end of the session. So look, what we're all doing, and the goal that I have is, how do we move from this picture of the deficit side of the agenda? This community could be Ottawa, Piscataway, or La Loche, Saskatchewan. And how do we move from this to growing healthy communities, healthy economies, and a healthy workforce? Let me start with one of my conclusions, that Indigenous people have always had a proud tradition of work. These are Maliseet and Mi'kmaq iron workers working the steel throughout America. So I want to go deeper into Indigenous 101, our collective knowledge gap. And what we've learned is that the organizations that have been most successful have done 2 things. They develop their knowledge know-how, and number 2, they select and execute strategies. Really nothing new in the world of management. Good knowledge, execute strategies, and measure your performance. So we're going to go into, and I want to talk about some of the things of it. Let me first of all contextualize, who are we talking about? The Aboriginal people of Canada are the First Nations Métis Inuit, and this came out of the Constitution in 82. Today, the population is 1.5 million, or about 4.9%. The 3 recognized constitutional groups, as I said, are First Nations Métis Inuit. There's been about 42% growth in the workforce and population. So there is a baby boom inside the Indigenous population in Canada. The average age is 32 compared to 42, which is why so many employers are looking at untapped labor market pools like the Indigenous one. And it's also driving business and opportunities in the areas of insurance, capital growth, projects, education, business, entrepreneurship, which is growing 8 times faster in the Indigenous community than mainstream, and of course urbanization. More than half live in the cities, and they go back and forth between communities and the cities. The gross domestic product, you might find interesting, of Indigenous people is about $27 billion, and it's going to grow by $10 billion over the next decade. One of our friends, my friends, Caroline Hilton, talks about growing the $100 billion Indigenous economy. So we do see growth and change happening throughout the market. Historically, though, when you go back and you look at the history of Canada, which predates the formation of Canada in 1867, you can see there were some original treaties with the indigenous tribes. The two-row wampum this symbolizes two boats, you in your boat, us in our canoe, each rowing our own canoes, steering our own direction, but sharing the waterway together. This is the Friend, Peace, and Forever treaties. The Royal Proclamation, 1763. This document is still cited in many legal courts today because it is the constitutional document for Canada. Half of the Royal Proclamation deals with Aboriginal land issues. Fast forward to the fur trade. Now, this is one area you may have learned in school. And again, it shows you how ingrained Indigenous people were in the fur trade. The Hudson Bay Company found it necessary to actually create a currency. And so the actual very first currency in Canada is capital M, capital B. You can look inside the Hudson Bay records and you will see capital MB, and that stood for a unit of exchange for pots, guns, and so on, and the beaver pelts. So this is really the TSS or the NASDAQ of the day. And Indigenous people were so ingrained, so intricate in the economy, we were part of the actual exchange economy. You may have heard of and some of you may have been to the Mayan ruins. And so you can look at the progress of Indigenous people globally. And what I want to read to you is wording from my friend Drew Hayden Taylor. Drew Hayden Taylor is a writer. He's at Ryerson University. And he talks about the Indigenous contributions of Indigenous people. And I think this really paraphrases the contribution historically. And he writes that Indigenous people have always had entrepreneurial cultures and systems. We were adept farmers, originally cultivating 2/3 of the foodstuffs that the world consumes today. In fact, at the time of contact and long before Grego Mendelssohn's experiments, the Huron in Ontario had genetically engineered 47 different types of varieties of corn. At the time when the Anishinaabe people had societal codes forbidding incest, the crown's heads of France and England were as inbred as poodles. And while Christians were burning heretics at the stake, suggesting that the earth wasn't the center of the universe, the Mayan Indians were charting the movement of the stars, creating a calendar within seconds of today's modern day atomic clocks. The Coast Salish in British Columbia practiced a matriarchal society, while on the other side of the Atlantic, women were the property of men. Sophisticated knowledge of ice flows, animal migrations, wind patterns, and temperature fluctuations ensured Indigenous people's success in the past, and today it educates our economies, our communities, our scientists, the military, and resource companies in the present. And ladies and gentlemen, those pyramids that you're looking at predate the Egyptian pyramids. So I think it paints another picture of Indigenous people who had thriving economies, they had social and economic systems, and it paints a very different picture with the cultural diversity from the medicine wheel to two-eyed seeing, which is how do we valuable traditional and Western ways of knowing, the Inuit with 8 societal principles, and the two-row wampum, and many, many other systems. But this was not Canada's vision. Canada's vision, after the formation of 1867 and through the treaty process, was, and this is often quoted, to kill the Indian and the child. What you've heard about the gravesides is one side or one aspect of this history of exclusion. And the gravesides, interestingly, I think 58% of Canadians are now paying attention and asking more questions about residential school. I want to explain to you 4 pillars of exclusion. And these 4 pillars will ground you in what I think will help you understand today's current context, today's current issues. There are social, political, economic, and education pillars of exclusion that have really fostered this deficit agenda that we see today. So back to this question. I'd asked you, or I'm going to ask you this question, and this is an Ipsos Reid poll question. Have you had any contact, in person or online, with an Indigenous person this past year? Write down your answer. Any contact, in person or online, with any Indigenous person or community this past year? Here are the 4 pillars. The first is social exclusion. So the past system was implemented where you could not leave the reserve without a travel authorization from the Indian agent, and this was in place from the 1880s to the 1940s. If you violated this, you could be imprisoned for 3 days and charged a $50 fine. Traditional ways of parenting were eroded, and ceremonies were outlawed, like the potlatch, many other ceremonies, and they went underground or they disappeared. There was political exclusion. One of the first pieces of legislation 9 years after Canada was formed was the Indian Act. It prohibited political formation by Native groups. The vote for Indigenous people was not granted till 1960, and that was under Diefenbaker, our chief, John Diefenbaker, and matriarchal systems were disrupted. So in some communities, the matriarchs basically ran and administered and oversaw the community, but this was replaced by men, which was again dominated through the Indian Act. Third area of exclusion, economic exclusion. So where Indigenous people started to become successful, changes would be made to the Indian Act. So, for example, around 1930, many of the First Nation groups had become successful at grain exchange, at grain sales and growing the crops and with the tools that they were given. And people used to sell their grain on the open exchange. And so in 1930 or 31, it was changed that Indians could no longer sell their grain on the oil exchange. The oil and gas reserves that many of the tribes had in the West could not go to the community. They go to Ottawa, and still today it's held in trust by the federal government. And we have an organization, the Oil and Indian Gas Resource Association, that oversees these investments. Métis script was a way to, if Métis did not take treaty, they were given a script which was 160 acres. And it's a story about how 92% of this Métis script ended up in the hands of the chartered banks. And so it's sort of well documented that the whole script system was meant to defraud Métis people. And this has been the source of many court debates. And just recently in 2013, the Supreme Court recognized that the government failed to distribute land to the Métis people. And this would be 1.6 million acres throughout Manitoba, Saskatchewan. The fourth area and the one is education exclusion. You've heard about the residential school between the 1880s right through to 1996, when the last school was closed. Children were forcibly removed. Métis were excluded from mainstream schools. Many simply didn't go to school. And this is a photograph of Albert Bay Residential School in British Columbia. So I want to fast forward. Those are the four pillars. And if you fast forward, in 1990, the Indigenous or the Aboriginal issue hit the living room of everybody, and it was through an event called Oka. Oka was the standoff in Montreal. And my former friend who passed away regrettably 2 years ago, former Grand Chief Joe Norton, was the chief during this Oka crisis, a dispute over a development of a golf course over ceremonial lands. This led to the creation of the Royal Commission report, which was announced in 1991 and ran for 6 years, with the report being released in 1996. Now, remember I asked you that question about the Ipsos Reid poll. Have you had any contact with an Indigenous person this past year? This question was asked in 1990. And here was the answer. In 1990, it said, have you had any contact with a visible Aboriginal person? 60% of Canadians said never or rarely. And in Quebec and the Maritimes, 80% said never or rarely. There was a huge social disconnect and gap in this country. And where did Oka break out? Quebec. Where did the burnt fishery dispute break out with lobster? Maritimes. We did not know each other. So you could argue that the trajectory from 1990 to today has been one of tremendous change and progress. We started to see more favorable Supreme Court decisions with Dalgamoot in 1997, requiring duty to consult, where governments need to consult, and industry with Indigenous groups for any development on, near, or around Indigenous lands. In 2000, there was an apology from the Prime Minister. 2014, another Supreme Court decision, Sequoten, which says that it talks about and confirms the existence of Indigenous title And the Truth and Reconciliation Report is launched in 2015 with 94 calls to action. So the future going forward. I hope that Indigenous 101 history gave you a sense of the contributions and the advances, as well as the roots of what I call the four pillars of exclusion. And those four pillars are the path, the same four pillars are the path to inclusion. This is Chief Joe Gosnell. And I'm going to put this in context in terms of the very first modern treaty in Canada was signed in 2000. And it was the Nisga'a of BC, because there was no treaties, of course, throughout British Columbia, and they have what we call modern day treaties. But let me put this in context in terms of the four pillars. In 1882, Albert Bay Residential School was built and put into operation. In 1887, the Nisga'a chiefs got in their canoes and they traveled down the coast to Victoria, British Columbia, to discuss the Nisga's land questions, and are turned away at the steps of the legislature by Premier Bill William Smith. 1927, Ottawa prohibits Aboriginal people from organizing to discuss the land question. These chiefs were very organized, the communities were organized, and it was outlawed. 1951, Parliament repeals the provision of the Indian Act that outlawed the potlatch. So the potlatch in these ceremonies have been outlawed. In 1951, it's repealed. And the other thing that they repealed was the land claims activities. They now said they could hire lawyers and begin to look at land claims. 1973, we get the major land claim decision with the Nisga'a, and it's the Calder decision. And the Supreme Court rules that Nisga's have held title before settlers came, but the judges are evenly split on whether Aboriginal title continues to exist. 1993-97, we get Delgamuukw decision. And 2000, this moment here, the Senate approves the Nisga's final agreement. And the Nisga'a treaty is ratified. Today, the Nisga'a have developed their social systems, they're developing their economic inclusion, they're developing their political systems, and they are moving forward in very, very progressive ways that are benefiting not just the Nisga'a people, but the people of BC and Canada. So I hope as you look today, I hope that gives you some context to Indigenous 101. It is a lot to absorb. And I look at sort of the upside of people and corporations and HR professionals, executives that can create change. The reason we need to is that today what we're facing is many stereotypes and gaps. And these are well researched by groups like Environics in Canada. This is a study at 2,500 Indigenous youth. They had very positive things about living in the city. They were looking forward to their careers, their education. They felt they could develop their culture and live in the city. They were more accepting of other people, immigrants and other languages, but these negative stereotypes prevailed. And these are ranked in order: addiction, lazy, uneducated, poor, and unemployed. This is the view of many Canadians. And these stereotypes follow Indigenous people around. And how can you start to make progress when you have these stereotypes so very prevalent? 77% of these Indigenous youth felt that they experienced those stereotypes, harassment, or discrimination within the previous year. Fast forward to 2017, we took a look at the corporate Indigenous engagement in Canada. We started to ask, well, what is the level of engagement? This was a survey of 511 companies. They were asked questions in 5 different areas, everything from their level of awareness and knowledge through to their partnerships and their alliances with Indigenous groups and people and companies. What do you think the average engagement index score is in Canada out of 100%? Take a guess. Here's the answer. The average engagement score was 13%, or 13 out of 100. 85% of Canadian companies are disengaged. It's not on the radar screen. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report and call to actions, which we'll talk about shortly, only 1 in 4 recognized it. So really, the majority of companies lack the motivation, the readiness, and the competencies to effectively engage with Indigenous people. These are some of the comments that people made, and these are managers responding to this study. And they said things like, we have no policy, we never thought about it, it's not applicable to our business, it doesn't fall under our business objectives, it's never been considered, there's no long-term strategy, there's no reason, we don't ask, we only look at skills, it's not on our radar, it never occurred to us. So it hasn't been a priority. And so I would say that it's not an HR and economic gap. We have this engagement gap. What we've done is said, how do we help companies build their inclusion strategies? And we brought some systems thinking and approaches. One such tool is the Inclusion Continuum. It's a 7-stage roadmap to becoming an employer and partner of choice. Managers love it because they're able to benchmark their strategies, their practices, and competencies on this inclusion continuum. Once you're able to do that, you're able to measure and monitor your performance. The first 3 stages are indifference, intimidation, and image. Indifference, no one cares. Intimidation, what's the minimum we need to do to avoid a lawsuit or an employment equity audit? And image is inclusion as public relations. They got lots of native art in the boardroom, but no native folks working there. Or they buy tables at our corporate events, but they're not filled that evening. The real business case is at initiation, where people discover that inclusion as a business imperative. Incubation is where it starts to get nurtured across the organization, from people and HR to procurement, corporate social responsibility, marketing, communications, and leadership. This enterprise-wide approach across those 5 areas, when we see companies adopt that, they have been the most successful at advancing their Indigenous engagement agendas. Integration, inclusion is a catalyst for growth. You see everything from formal joint ventures and partnerships. You see strong relationships with communities. You see integrated strategies and practices. And finally, stage 7, you're practicing inclusion for full inclusion performance. So that's the overview. And within this, we have a series of what we call the 9-point framework, which is really, how do you help managers develop their competencies within these? And so, there are things like responsibility and accountability, positioning, relationships and trust, investment and resources. Things like positioning, the one in the very center, is about what's your brand? What is your brand, and how are you attracting and positioning yourself with the Indigenous market? It's a fantastic question. It's the first one we start with, because most companies say, well, we don't have a brand, and that's the place to start. It's about brand, attraction, and positioning with the Indigenous workforce, the marketplace, and the communities. Here's one around responsibility and accountability, which is who's responsible for Indigenous engagement? Who's got the functional responsibility and the line responsibilities? How are managers monitored and measured on their work with Indigenous people and communities? So this accountability framework, companies who build that into their practices have found great success. So really, between the 9-point framework and the inclusion continuum, this is one particular system that helps a company create a baseline of their performance. It helps them create a directional strategy to move forward. And it does generate results by connecting this enterprise-wide approach from HR through to procurement, corporate social responsibility. How do those big 3 work together? And then your narrative. How is marketing and communications telling your story internally and externally? And leadership, your commitment to advancing this for your workplace and indeed for your industry and for your suppliers. We just launched this Employer of Choice program, and we are an ISO certified organization. We see the role of certification in helping companies advance their inclusion strategies, practices, and performance. This is brand new in 2021, and we think it's going to help, again, improve the metrics and the standards around workplace employment and engagement. Now, what's one of the things that all of you can do? You may have heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Report. And this report came out in 2015. And again, it speaks to, and this was under Senator Murray Sinclair was the commissioner. And I encourage you all to read it. And in particular, I want you to look at Call to Action 92, which is the corporate calls to action. And there was calls to action to the public sector, municipalities, schools, and many, many other groups. The TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation, was a process, and they went and they met with students to hear the stories. And for many, it was the first time that they had opened up about their experience at residential schools. It was very emotional, it was very painful, but it created a place where they could tell their stories in a safe and culturally appropriate environment and manner. The gravesides discoveries starting in Kamloops, then Cowasis, and there will be more, because we know that there are graveyards throughout residential schools. In fact, an alarming stat is your chances of dying in World War II were 1 in 25. Your chances of dying in a residential school were 1 in 26. I want you to see the corporate calls to action 92. There are really 3. And these 3, they're saying to businesses, align with the corporate calls. We want you to commit to meaningful consultation, commit to relationship building, and commit to FPIC, which is free, prior, and informed consent. Create equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities in the corporate sector, and create long-term sustainable benefits for economic development projects. And thirdly, provide education for management and staff, exactly what the Institute is doing today. The fourth one related to this is UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And British Columbia has already adopted it. They've created their own adoption called DRIPA. And again, you're going to see more and more attention around the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. So there it is. There's the calls to action. It doesn't cost you any money. It costs you a commitment, and to understand what it means in terms of the risks and the opportunities for individual firms and for groups like the Institute itself, the CIA group, to get engaged and involved in the TRC calls to action. I want you to hear the words of Murray Sinclair.
Many people have said over the years that I've been involved in the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, why can't you just get over it and move on? And my answer has always been, why can't you always remember this? Because this is about memorializing those people who have been victims of a great wrong. Why don't you tell the United States to get over 9/11? Why don't you tell this country to get over all of the veterans who died in the Second World War instead of honoring them once a year? Why don't you tell your families to stop thinking about all of your ancestors who died? Why don't you turn down and burn down all of those headstones that you put up for all of your friends and relatives over the years? It's because it's important for us to remember. We learn from it. And until people show that they have learned from this, we will never forget. And we should never forget, even once they have learned from it, because this is a part of who we are. It's not just a part of who we are as survivors and children of survivors and relatives of survivors, but as part of who we are as a nation. And this nation must never forget what it once did to its most vulnerable people.
That's Senator Murray Sinclair. If you ever have a chance to listen to this man, please do so. I think that the TRC and even the word reconciliation is about moving forward with new relationships. I mean, the word itself to me almost carries this tinge of guilt, and that's not what it's intended. If you actually look up the definition of reconciliation, it's a noun to build friendly relations. So what are some things that you can be doing as an institute? What can you be doing as individual members and organizations and companies that belong to the institute? Well, one of them is to do these land acknowledgements, and you're probably hearing more and more about land acknowledgements. And I want to just talk about some of the actions and ideas and advances in Indigenous innovation. A land acknowledgement is you are acknowledging the territory, but there's a deeper connection to Indigenous people. And I want to describe the Indigenous perspective of why land acknowledgements are so important. Indigenous people have a deep relationship with the land. There's a cultural and spiritual relationship, a physical relationship, the social and emotional. And I think this relationship, you have Indigenous people that pray to the land, I have friends when they take wood from the land for burning, they offer tobacco. When people go pick medicines, they will offer tobacco and ceremonies to the water and to the land. And so you see this very deep connection to place and names and land. And so when you're doing this land acknowledgement, you're learning something as people about the territories where you are perhaps doing a meeting or an event or a conference, and you're acknowledging the historical roots of the people and the territories. And it has this deeper spiritual connection for Indigenous people. If you look across the lands, you'll find there's renaming. This is Lake Minnewaca in Banff. And you're seeing that there are some histories coming out about the history of exclusion in terms of this one is about the Inuit Project Surname. And this story is about Inuit who went through a renaming. And this started about in the 40s, and their surnames were replaced with letters. East is for the east side of the Arctic, west is for the west side, and they were given numbers. And so they grew up with this identity, having lost their surnames and being known as East, 6008. Abraham Apik was hired in 1970 or 72 to go through the Arctic and explain to people that they could take back their surnames, and it was called Project Surname. And he went through and he met with people in communities, and some people took the names back and some were changed, and it's still happening to this day. In fact, one of the calls to action is to remove the costs related to changing your name back to its proper name. So again, the importance of place and names is really important to Indigenous people. And when you do a land acknowledgement, you're connecting. Here are just some examples on a website. This is from our friends at SAS Polytechnique. This is part of their PowerPoint decks. It's built into all their presentations, and they honor the Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories and the ancestral lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis. This is this is an email signature line. What's interesting about this one, it's a little more than an acknowledgement. It actually involves a teaching. So in this one, Rita Casa is saying, she's acknowledging the Mississaugas and the Haudenosaunee nations, but she talks about the dish with one spoon wampum. Remember that wampum belt that I said that had the two boats going side by side? Well, the dish with one spoon wampum agreement is a peace agreement. And it basically says you'll take what you need, leave something in the dish for others, and leave the dish clean. So a bit of teaching to go with that one. This is one of my board members, Sean Sunias. He works for Farm Credit Corporation. He works out of Regina. And so he acknowledges he's headquartered on the Treaty 4 land and the traditional homeland of the Métis in Saskatchewan. This is interesting. This is Australia. This is a friend of mine who wrote to me after the graveside sites were discovered. And she wrote to me and she was reaching out to her Canadian friends just to offer her sympathies and to say that they were thinking about us. And I went back and I looked at her acknowledgement. So in Australia, they don't say land acknowledgement, they call welcome to country. And they've been doing this much longer than Canada. And you do a welcome to country. And so, you pay your deepest respects to the traditional custodians of the country across Australia. When they say welcome to country, they're referring to the territory in which they live. And here she thanks the elders who have demonstrated over 60,000 years of sustainable Indigenous business and asks them to guide us back to a more prosperous and purposeful future. I want to tell you about Luminary. This could be a very interesting intersection point for CIA. We started down this road to say there is an engagement gap we told you about between corporate Canada and Indigenous business. Well, there's a third leg to the stool of this gap, and it's the academic community. And so Luminary's vision is to be the most impactful network and partnership of its kind, where academia and Indigenous business grow research and innovations for economic transformation, employment, and well-being. We have over 140 partners. We have 70 universities and colleges. I have over half of the business schools, 50 Indigenous businesses, over 25 NGOs, and just last week, the 13 deans of agriculture signed on as Luminary partners. What we're doing is co-creating a strategy. And we started developing this in early 2021. We held 14 strategy sessions through the spring and did a national gathering on June 23rd. And this month, we're sharing the strategy with our partners. This, to me, is a way to really accelerate this idea of economic transformation, employment, well-being, if we can harness the academic and innovation agenda to create new products, new processes, new systems, and new know-how. So one of the things that we're doing under the Luminary umbrella is we're doing work in Indigenous food sovereignty and security. And we're, with the support of Protein Industry Canada, Ag Canada, and Nutrien, we're developing out a 5-year strategy in the agribusiness and agri-food area. And this, of course, folks, became top of mind for all Canadians because of COVID, food sovereignty, food security. And so we think this could be a very, very interesting strategy that could benefit not just Indigenous people, but all Canadians going forward. Some other things that we're doing is working with the Human Rights Commission in the area, for example, in the finance and banking sector. And how do we look at both the supply and the demand side challenge and issues and opportunities that could be developed further? And the Human Rights Commission and Indigenous Works have partnered together. We've leveraged some additional funding support from Employment Services Development Canada, and we're in the process of inviting people from the finance and the banking sector to participate. If you know of any people that might be of interest to this, we would be pleased to share this charter, and they can be sitting at the table with us starting this fall and working with us for the next 12 to 18 months on this important research work in the banking and financial services sector. So I want to conclude with going forward. Two-eyed seeing. Two-eyed seeing, Albert Marshall was our elder and thought leader at our national event on June 23rd. And he talks about traditional and Western ways of knowing that are going to benefit everybody. And to me, it's sort of one of the cornerstones of our work going forward is it's not about being judgmental that one system is better than the other. It's how to take the values and the best of both and indeed create some Indigenous-led processes and approaches and models. And if we do this and we do this well, we're going to grow the inclusion that we're all seeking. We're going to see young people with the education, the skills, and the training. We're going to see workplaces create opportunities for people. We're going to see opportunities. That's my grandfather was a war vet, that our war veterans are going to be taken care of. Just this week, you saw that the Catholic bishops apologized. In the bottom right-hand corner is a photo of Archbishop Weisgerber with former Grand Chief Phil Fontaine and myself, where I facilitated the story of their journey becoming brothers, where Chief Fontaine adopted, and him and his brothers adopted Archbishop Weisgerber in ceremony. So inclusion covers many areas of society, but of course, ours is in you, the workplace and employers, in terms of what we can do. I think to make sense of it in a company, I do believe that we need to create this foundation around the history. And what we covered today was looking at the 4 pillars of exclusion, which are the same 4 paths of growing the path of inclusion. We're going to create more change through some employer leadership. We need and continue to embrace new innovations in Indigenous inclusion, which I shared with you today. I hope that you'll look at truth and reconciliation in ways that you can adopt land acknowledgements and the TRC corporate calls to action. And we can explore more about how to help you and your employer members move up the inclusion continuum. And finally, the area of research and innovation. Maybe there will be some very interesting ways to write some new statements around policy, insight, and advice statements based on the work that Luminary is doing to advance Indigenous innovation. So I want to leave you, as we go to a close here. I was 2 years ago, just before COVID broke out. This is Johnny Arcand. He's from Debden, Saskatchewan, near Big River, Saskatchewan, where my family roots are on the Métis Cree side. And Johnny Arcand runs the Métis Fest, Fiddle Fest, and he's one of the world's leaders and world-renowned experts of the Métis fiddle. Was invited to Ireland, one of only 27 people in the world. He's won all kinds of awards. Anyways, I went up to Johnny, and because a friend from Alberta wanted to meet him. And we were at his Fiddle Fest. We knelt down, and because there was music playing, I said, "Hey, Johnny, Kelly Lendsay here. You know, my grandmother, Isabel Martel, and I want to introduce you to my friend, Mr. Arkand here." Johnny took my arm, and he had tears coming down his eyes. He said, "Your grandmother, Isabel Martel, only one that ever believed in me. She believed in me." That was really, I mean, I wasn't expecting this. It was obviously quite emotional. And you never know what and how people will remember in terms of how you move them. And I want you to remember this in terms of reason to believe with a song by, you're going to love this song. It's not a fiddle song, but it's Buffy St. Marie. And we put her song to this video that I'd like to close with.
Sometimes you got to take a stand. Just because you think you can, you got to run, you got to run. Whether you're a woman or whether you're a man, sometimes you got to take a stand. Just because you think you can, you got to run, you got to run. Crying against the odds, you're in a trance. Say, who did you think you are to have a chance? You're a no one from a place where everyone knows your face and come and go away than all the sun. So you better hang on and hey, you better run. Cause here's your chance and your race is begun. Down in a hole, you feel like two different people in your soul. Feel like a loser until you see that as you bend, you learn to be your own best friend. You learn how and you learn when to take a stand on the spirit of the wind. Whether you're a woman or whether you're a man, sometimes you got to take a stand. Just because you think you can, you got to run, you got to run. Babe, ain't we been down? We've been so broken, been so low that I kiss the ground. But you can see yourself a winner beyond the money and the greed. Beyond the prize is a pure untested need. It could be a champion is more than luck and speed. His power and freedom in the spirit of the wind. Whether you're a woman or whether you're a man, sometimes you got to take a stand. Just because you know you can, you got to run, you got to run. Standing up.
Thank you, Buffy St. Marie. And folks, I hope that gave you a reason to believe in the path forward. thank you for joining us today. We look forward to our continued work and conversations with the CIA group, and want to wish you all the very best, and do hope that you will be able to action some of the ideas and the concepts that are presented here today. I want to conclude with, this picture. We're all in the same canoe. It's about learning how to paddle together, support each other. Sometimes there's rapids to navigate, and so we need each other. And with that, Tapuina Naskuman, thank you very much. All the very best.